Is Putin visiting an unlikely ally in his campaign to shore up diplomatic support for his war in Ukraine? And is he laying out his case to somebody, I guess, in foreign media? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about this pretty weird story. So overall, the takeaway here is that Putin is actually conducting, for the first time in 25 years, the Russian head of state is visiting the North Korean head of state. And this is a huge diplomatic coup for North Korea, a country who is, known as the Hermit Kingdom, in part because they are so unbelievably aggressive and repressive in their treatment of their own citizens and vis-a-vis the Korean Peninsula. Now, Putin, of course, has had to pull out all the stops to find potential partners in his effort to fund and equip his war in Ukraine. And North Korea is a natural partner, given the fact that they are unbelievably poor, but rich in Soviet-era military equipment. So there was a natural partnership to be made there, with North Korea providing or selling Russia military equipment. In turn, North Korea receiving resources, money to fund other aspects of their state. And more importantly, it's being provided diplomatic legitimacy on the international stage. Now, what's interesting is a couple of reasons. First is that Kim is looking at becoming an internationally recognized nuclear state. You might recall that both Koreas, North and South, consider themselves kind of independent nations. Both consider themselves the legitimate rulers of Korea in the aggregate, the entire peninsula. And both sides agree that Korea should be reunified. There's just a lot of questions about which side is going to be the government of a unified Korea, right? As we talked, North Korea long been under UN Security Council sanction over its nuclear weapons and missile programs. And of course, Russia also circumventing Western sanctions. So it's definitely a case of two entities who are on the outside, so to speak, of the international community because of their behavior, finding common ground sort of out of desperation. Now, the U.S. State Department has described Putin as incredibly desperate over the past few months. What they say is amid setbacks in Ukraine, which is not true. The last several months have been have been probably the most successful period for Russia in the Ukraine conflict since their initial invasion. And North Korea, of course, has been key to providing Putin with the resources he needs to conduct this sort of new tactical shift that Putin has undergone, right? North Korea has provided dozens of ballistic missiles that Putin has used to strike Ukrainian infrastructure targets, and more than 11,000 containers, likely around 5 million individual artillery shells, have been provided to Russia. Now, many of those are unserviceable and Russia actually has to refurbish them, but it is much easier to refurbish an artillery shell than it is to go ahead and manufacture a new one from scratch. And in a lot of cases, these North Korean artillery shells are still serviceable and sent directly to the front lines. Now, of course, both countries pretend that this arms transfer hasn't happened, which would be a violation of UN Security Council resolutions to whatever extent that means. But even on this channel, we've seen video of Russian soldiers in Ukraine using North Korean shells and saying, these Korean shells that we got from the North, man, they sure suck, right? So it's pretty comical that they even maintain this farce that they are adhering to UN Security Council resolutions. But what's even more interesting is that this op-ed that Putin has written. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. But first, of course, you guys are going to want to check out some Strike Gum if you haven't already. Strike Gum is the zero sugar energy drink alternative, right? Each piece of gum contains 90 milligrams of caffeine. That is twice as much as the leading caffeinated gums and as much caffeine as a Red Bull or an Amp Energy, plus 100 milligrams of alpha GPC in every piece. So if you're looking for a better way to consume an energy drink, right, this is what you want, right? It's in mint flavor. Each pack contains the equivalent of 5 energy drinks, right? 5 pieces. You can chew, pop it in, and get back to work with the energy you need. So check us out at strikegum.com. Thanks to the dozens of people who've left us reviews, or I think we're up to hundreds now of people who've left us reviews, not just here on Strike Gum, but on Amazon. So check us out, Amazon. You can search Strike Gum or go to strikegum.com. Okay, so here's where things are really interesting. And this is the fact that Putin has dropped an op-ed in North Korea's leading state newspaper. And you can see that it is weird, to say the least. Weird for a couple of reasons. First off, North Korea, you guys probably are aware that other than a tiny number of its senior government and intelligentsia that are deeply connected to Kim Jong-un, other than those folks, almost nobody's reading the newspaper, right? The average North Korean is extremely impoverished, right? The entire state produces about $1,000 of GDP per capita, making it one of the most impoverished countries in the world. And we know that that production, that state ability, is really, really limited and concentrated in the hands of the governing class. So Putin, right. So that is who. So basically, this is a message for Kim Jong-un and his maybe, I'm going to say, 1,000-person innermost circle, right, that actually govern the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK. Now, what's interesting is, first off, Putin, in his fashion, has summarized the entire history of the relationship between North Korea and the Soviet Union and then Russia, through the Soviet times, through the Korean War. But he acknowledges that he says, I highly appreciate the DPRK's strong support for the Russian special military operation in Ukraine, which is not saying you've provided us all these weapons, but it's kind of thanks for your strong support, right? And its solidarity with Russia on key international issues, defending common priorities and views in the UN, right? And what I thought was most interesting is kind of his public perspective, right? Remember, this is his message to North Korea's intelligentsia and ruling class, right? And he says, Pyongyang was and remains our staunch, like-minded person and supporter, ready to resolutely resist the desire of the collective West to prevent the formation of a multipolar world based on justice, mutual respect for sovereignty, and consideration of each other's interests. Which is a reminder that, again, this is kind of bizarre coming from a country who is actively annexing another sovereign nation. But again, to Putin, Ukraine is not a sovereign nation, and consideration of Russia's interests is code for Russia deserves to dominate all of its neighboring countries. And so that kind of that is sort of the viewpoint where Putin is coming from. Now, here's what's interesting is that he says the United States of America is trying its best to impose on the world a so-called rules-based order, which in essence is nothing more than a global neo-colonial dictatorship based on double standards. Okay, citation needed on that one, guys. Countries that do not agree with this approach and pursue independent policies are faced with increasingly severe external pressure. And on one hand, there are some sort of arguments around this. For example, Iran, who wants to pursue a nuclear program, is subject to sanction by the West, certainly. But you also have things that are sort of comically overblown. For example, independent policies in Putin's case is code for I want to invade my neighbor, or in 2014 I want to annex my neighbor's territory and declare independent states that we've backed with our military, and then we pretend. As you might know, in the case of Crimea, where the Russian military entered, but they had removed all their patches. So, according to Russia and Putin, they were just enthusiastic citizens who just happened to have Russian military gear. So that is what an independent policy means to someone like Putin, right? And they say the U.S. leadership views such a natural and legitimate desire for independence and autonomy as a threat to its dominance in the world. Again, this is something that is sort of like there is a not crazy person argument for this. Again, you look at countries that have different viewpoints, behave in ways that aren't aligned with the West, but someone like China, for example, but China gets a pretty big pass. The U.S. leadership, while they acknowledge that China does some screwed up things, like putting their Muslim population in internment camps or stealing U.S. Intellectual property through a state-backed campaign of espionage and then cloning it for their own market, those kind of things are not necessarily independence and autonomy, but it's worth noting that the U.S. absolutely does business and does not sanction China in any measurable way. And so when Putin says these sort of things, you can tell it's window dressing, right? Of course, they say the United States and its satellites, again, a sort of fascinating perspective that the U.S. believes that the EU and Western Europe are satellite states, which is, again, just not really the case, declare that their goal is to inflict strategic defeat on Russia. They're doing everything they can to prolong and further inflame the conflict in Ukraine, which they themselves provoked by supporting and organizing an armed coup in Kiev in 2014, and then the war in Donbass, right? Which they're talking about, of course, the Orange Revolution, in which case a Russian-backed government was kicked out, and replaced with a democratically elected one. Again, just because Putin's stooge got replaced doesn't mean that they were replaced with a different stooge. Again, when you, in polling data of Ukrainians, most Ukrainians wanted to see a more Western pivot. And just because something bad happens doesn't mean it was a conspiracy. It sort of makes sense given that since 2014, the Ukrainian economy with its more Western focus has grown quite significantly, right? And of course, Russia says, we want peace. We've asked for peace, but we've seen Russia's peace plan. Russia's peace plan is Ukraine gives up large portions of its territory and abandons its military and then is allowed to negotiate the details. So this is just a reminder of just sort of how Russian propaganda and how Russian sort of half-truths work. And you see he doubles down, referring to it as a neo-Nazi Kiev regime supported by the West with money, weapons, and intelligence data, right? And he says allowing and encouraging the use of modern Western weapons and equipment to strike Russian territory. Again, this is a classic Putin sort of Putinism where he goes, oh, how could they allow these Western weapons and equipment to strike Russian territory? And you should ask yourself is, why did Putin use Russian territory to invade Ukraine, right? Invading them from another, opening a new front in the war, quite literally, and did so basically daring Ukraine to strike them. This is a logical consequence. As you can see, right, we know that Ukraine observed Russian forces that pushed into Volchansk and Lipsy, right? These forces staged 1 to 2 kilometers over the border. So literally in full view of Ukrainian troops, but because of the Western prohibition, they were unable to strike them. And so, again, as I point out, if someone's has robbed your house once, then they arrive just over the curb of your driveway and slowly over the course of hours bring in more and more of their friends with baseball bats and chains and guns. And then you sit there and if you do anything to stop them, they go, we're mere innocents. These people are trying to harass us for just gathering innocently in the street, right? Putin was daring. Putin understood that by doing this, the West would change their policies and that therefore he got to play the victim. And you see, he loves this victim card. He loves it. It has been a great, great victim card for him to play. So again, it's just a reminder when you see these kind of articles that you can tease out the difference between nonsense, which there's a lot, like mildly true things that Putin gets to lump himself in with, right? Again, a country that, you know, a country like Iran who's like, hey, we want to develop nuclear weapons. It's not good. I don't love a world I want a world with less nuclear weapons, not more. But that is technically a sovereign nation's right. But it's also sovereign nation's right to say, listen, our policy is we don't trade with people that develop nuclear weapons. That's it. No, that's another state's right. You can't force a country to trade with you. So this is sort of the thing with sanctions, right? Sanctions aren't punitive. They are a country's choice. Right? So if you want to live in an independent world, it's just like this. There's no law that says you have to get along with your neighbors. You can be the most annoying, unbearable jerk. That is your American right. But you shouldn't be shocked when your neighbors refuse to help you when your house is burning down, right? So the takeaway from this is don't look at what Putin says, because that's total lies and nonsense. It should tell you right away who he considers his friends. And the fact that he is one of the only heads of state who's visiting North Korea, a country that runs has a frighteningly high rate of running gulag-style re-education camps, has an unbelievable amount of poverty, like medieval levels of poverty, truly. I remember there was one North Korean soldier who defected, and when he got medical care in South Korea, he was actually found to have internal parasites, like something that, again, you would only see in a medieval country, truly, like a country with no modern medicine. And so you see these things, and that alone should tell you that Putin, if he can't find friends that are legitimate and good, and this is who he's relying on for really deep, meaningful support, that should tell you everything you need to know. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. A huge thank you to the Colonel Tier members of Combat Vet News. We're actually, I'm on the road, so I'm just, we're going to delay about 24 hours the video. So be patient. It'll drop Wednesday instead of Tuesday. But I appreciate you guys and your support, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.